Beliefs about vampires, werewolves, witches, and wizards are widespread.
Exactly what is a serial killer?
Our house was 2 rooms, and there was 7 of us.
He held the bat like this.
That's why I have characters who sort of expose themselves.
And everybody always say, Coach Carter, Samuel Jackson is taller than you. I said, I know, but I think I'm better looking.
Thank all of y'all for being here. I cannot see, but it looks like every seat is full, so that's amazing. But it also kind of throws me for a loop a little bit, because my first question for y'all was going to be, you've been out of prison now for almost 13 years. And I was, a lot of my students are younger, obviously, and may not be familiar with the case. And I was going to initially ask you, in these 13 years that have passed, have you noticed that people just started to kind of forget, like you're out, so like the thing's over, it's done. But when I look out here and I see all these people, I think they've answered my question. People haven't forgotten. So y'all give yourselves a round of applause again for being here and supporting us. Because as I think Joshua said, this isn't over. This is not a closed case. And so one of the reasons why I invited Damien and Lorri here were to hopefully use this as a platform to bring awareness to the fact that this is not, just because Damien's sitting here, this isn't over yet. So I'm hoping that we can be of help in some way, and we can talk a little bit about that. But I had to share like a quick little thing, and then we can talk a little. I was telling Damien and Lorri on the way over here that I reached out to them at first on social media, and then I tried some other form of communication. And I did that, and the very next day, Damien posts on Instagram. I've done thousands of interviews, and I'll never do another interview again. And I thought, oh crap! Like he read my email, and he's just like ticked off now. So like, that's not good, So, but then Lorri emailed me, I think maybe the next day or 2 days after, and said, yeah, we'd love to do that. So, thank y'all so much. I know how busy y'all are, and I know how many things are going on from talking to you earlier in your lives right now. So, we're so honored and thrilled that y'all are here. And I've been following your story for 25 years now, and probably no more than maybe I even should. I don't know if it ever borders on like stalker knowledge or not, but so yeah, this is just incredible. So thank y'all again for working with me, Lorri, and all the details and the roadblocks that we encountered. We made it work. It's a beautiful day, and no rain, a little bit of fog, but we made it. It's great.
You've been such a joy to work with, truly. And then we were actually more than happy to come and speak with y'all today, because this is really important to us. And we're glad you're here. Thank you.
Yeah, and thank y'all again for being here. Can y'all hear Lorri? No, okay. You might want to, I think the mic's on, but you might have to move it a little bit closer. So y'all hear nothing?
What, maybe this. Let me try this.
Hello. Can you hear that at all?
Yes.
You just have to talk loud.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to also say thank y'all for bringing us here, for wanting to do this, even if some of you are probably just here just to get out of going to a class today. We still appreciate the fact that y'all wanted to be part of this and hear the story and keep it alive. Like you were just saying about, you were asking about, do people forget about the case? And thankfully, like through the years, every time people do start to forget about it, there's always some weird little strange thing that happens that brings up attention again. Like the last one was recently, that show Stranger Things. there were like a bunch of stories they released to the media about how one of the characters in that show, Eddie Munson, the guy who dies in the last season, that they had based that character off of me. And it brought like a whole new, audience who weren't even born whenever I went to prison, to be interested in the case. So there's always some weird little thing like that happens and drums things up again.
And I think that again, it's just a testament to people's sort of passion about this injustice that is taking place and that's still taking place. And we'll talk about that hopefully too, about your efforts to clear your name in the roadblocks and the hurdles. And I know there may be some legalities about things maybe you can't say or whatever. But yeah, those sorts of things. And just another little anecdote. In organizing this, I have to meet with different groups on campus to sort of make my case for why are these people going to come here? Like, what are they going to talk about? This sort of thing. And I went to the Student Government Association, and I'm getting old, so like now my students are the age that my kids are practically. And I asked them, how many of you have heard of Damien Echols? And a couple of people raised their hands, Lorri Davis, the case. And then I said, how many of y'all have seen the Midnight Gospel? And they're like, oh, yeah. I'm like, you remember the Goldfish Man? And they're like, oh, yeah. And I was like, that was Damien Echols' voice. And then they were like, okay, let's take a vote on this. Okay, unanimous. We'll pay the money to get him here. And so, whatever it takes, right? But again, it's keeping you and your story, all story, in the public eye. And I think it's important until, and maybe even after it's closed and settled, it's still important to talk about, because this could happen to any one of us. I don't think we like to think that, but I certainly know growing up here in the South and in St. Tammany Parish, I was often targeted by police, and not to minimize what you went through, because I certainly didn't experience to that degree, but just being bullied and harassed because I had long hair and I had a septum, and all my students were like, oh my God, you do, I tell my students too much stuff, but, so I was a weird looking guy, so it's like, yeah, let's pick on it. Plus I was poor, so it's like, let's pick on this guy. And so, of course, you experienced that. So, what are y'all's, or where do you stand, do you think, right now with your appeals with the Supreme Court to get the DNA testing done to exonerate you for once and for all? If you can talk about those things, I know that's probably...
I'm actually going to let Lorri answer that, just because I pay almost zero attention to anything that goes on in the case now. It was one of those things where I, had to look at this stuff for almost 20 years. And whenever I got out, I thought, I don't want, I had to spend 20 years of my life wrapped up in this stuff. And the last thing I wanted to do was spend whatever, remaining years I had, left alive in the world focused on something that had stolen so much of my life from me. So I just sort of, gave it up to God, gave it up to Lorri, gave it up to the lawyers, and paid absolutely no attention to it whatsoever until they tell me you have to be in court on this day. So I'm going to let Lorri answer.
Let's see if I can you hear me better? Okay, all right. Well, it's always a long, drawn-out story when you're talking about legal cases, and actually they make it that way on purpose, as we learned. But what happened was back in about, I'm going to say about 2018, we learned about a new technique, a new process actually for DNA testing. And it's very sophisticated. It's almost like a vacuum that can come and like extract DNA from fabric, or in our case, the ligatures that tied up the victims were shoelaces. And so it's almost certain that the DNA of the murderers are in those knots to this day. So we asked the state of Arkansas for access to the evidence, and we were going to pay for the testing, And we were actually told then, yes, absolutely, you can have the evidence. So we start going through the process, and then, it takes forever even to get answers. By 2020, everything shut down when the pandemic hit. And then in 2021, they came back and told us that the evidence was either lost, burned up in a fire, or what was the third thing? It was 3 different things. And that they didn't even have the evidence. And we started doing all of these checks, like FOI, Freedom of Information requests, trying to see where was the fire or who was the last person to handle the evidence. We ended up having to, and then we had a new prosecutor came on board and said, you know what, no, you can't test the evidence anymore. You're gonna have to take us to court on it. And so we ended up having to sue the police department to even go in to see if the evidence was there, and of course it was. Perfectly preserved, thankfully, but the evidence was right there. Everyone could see it. There was it wasn't lost, wasn't burned up in a fire, wasn't destroyed. So since then, 2021, we have been in a legal battle trying to get the evidence to test it. And we are now in the Supreme Court waiting for them. We've been in the Supreme Court now since it's coming up on, it'll be 2 years in May, and waiting for them to give us an answer as to whether we can test this DNA or not. We're thinking we should get an answer this spring. Once that happens, we're going full on into testing that DNA, and I think after that we're going to have a huge turnaround in this case, because I really do believe we're going to learn who the murderers really are. And Damien and I, all of us, really want to use this platform that we have built over all of these years to make some big changes in the criminal justice system, just because the story just keeps going and gets more and more infuriating all the time.
Yeah, I mean, other than the obvious reason of not wanting to admit that they were wrong, but then also, realizing that in doing so, they would owe you a substantial amount of money for the time you spent in prison. And I think I saw the new prosecutor, the DA or whatever, said it would be between you and Jesse and Jason like $60 million. And what I've read a lot about death penalty cases, how much money is actually spent to kill someone. And that's not even really a drop in the bucket compared to how much money they house these prisoners, even though they treat them horribly. But sometimes for many years while these appeals go through, this sort of thing. And so, yeah, it's so hard for me to wrap my mind around that, other than the fact that they don't want to admit that they were wrong, and then they don't want to compensate you for the time that they stole from you. Your formative years, I mean, I can't, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times, like I can't even fathom spending that portion of my life locked up like you were. And I know, I've listened to interviews with you before where you said, I've talked about this so much, and I wanted to steer the conversation away from that, but you said it's almost like the equivalent of, think of the worst thing that's ever happened to you in your whole life. And then imagine having to talk about that over and over and over and over and over in front of a whole bunch of strangers, which sounds like kind of a nightmare, right? And it's like, so I didn't want to do that to you and have you relive all that. And I think Joshua did a great introduction just to give us sort of the background of the case, so we have some context. But yeah, I mean, do you agree that that's sort of what the motivation on their part is just because they don't want to, A, admit they were wrong, but B, face that possibility that you can come back and
I think even kind of saying it like that, though, it's almost like giving them the benefit of the doubt, like they don't want to have to admit they were wrong. It almost like implies or lets them off the hook as like they made a mistake.
Yeah.
And I don't think they did make a mistake. I think they knew what they were doing from day one. Yeah. Even when we did the first round of DNA testing and were able to test hair that was found at the crime scene. It matched one of the stepfathers of one of the victims, who was also an informant for the police department. He had been working with them on a lot of other drug cases. And the people that he had been working with had also been caught up in a lot of really, really shady stuff. Like one of the people who actually found the bodies of the victims was not even fired, not prosecuted, but he was forced to retire or resign from the police department after he was caught in a public bathroom molesting a young boy. So these were incredibly corrupt individuals who, you know, at the time that I was arrested, the entire West Memphis Police Department was under investigation by the FBI. So I think they knew from the very beginning what they were doing, and I think they did it to cover up for the person that they knew had actually committed the murders. So not only is it going to, you know, come out that you sent an innocent person to death row, sent two other ones to prison for life, you let the actual murderer walk the streets for 20 years while this is going on, but there's all of this other corruption connected to it. I think it would be like you know how when you set up a line of dominoes and you tip one over and they all fall over in a line? I think that's exactly what they're afraid of in this case, that if one piece of it comes out, then the next piece is going to come out, and the next piece is going to come out, and there's going to be a lot of stuff exposed.
Yeah, and I think, you know, I mean, because I've been reading, you know, I know John Mark Byers, who is very, for lack of a better word, very outspoken personality, who changed his stance. You know, I remember watching in the first documentaries where he would just do these horrendous things and say these horrendous things about you, and but then later on he changed his tune after he realized, like, okay, and then he started to direct his ire onto someone else, and I don't, you know, and I've heard you say this before too, I don't want to like point a finger at like, well, we know it was this guy now, because that's what happened to you, you know, and so even though all the evidence points to this one particular person, it's still giving, you know, innocent into proven guilty sort of thing, and that wasn't really done in your case, you know, and you had talked about, you know, you were poor and basically looked at as someone who was just like a throwaway human being, and like if they murdered you in the name of the state, nobody would care. Mm-hmm. Nobody would care. And what's disturbing more than that, or just as much as that, which you've also pointed out, is that there are hundreds, if not thousands, of other people currently in that same boat that didn't have a documentary crew come out and film the trial. If that hadn't happened, we wouldn't be sitting here today. You know, so Bruce Sanowski and Joel Berlinger, or Joe Berlinger. That was, I still remember the first time I saw that. We had, you know, lived out in a little trailer out in the country, and it was a big deal because we got direct TV. You know, we used to only get like 2 channels, and then we got direct TV, and so we had satellite. And one of the channels we got was HBO, and I'd never heard of this before, and so I turned it on, and I was riveted. And the other ones hadn't come out yet at that point, I don't think. And just thought, just like Joshua was saying, and I'm sure you've heard this a million times, like, wow, I could have been, you know, I grew up in a small little town. I didn't look like the other kids. I didn't play football. You know, I didn't go to, you know, the things that most kids were supposed to go to, like prom and all that stuff. That could happen to me. And I think that should scare all of us, like how easily that could happen. You know, anybody who stands out for any reason. And now, as someone older, I try to blend in a little bit better. And I haven't worn this jacket, I don't think, in about maybe 15 years, but I thought in Damien's honor, he's like, I'm gonna put on my black leather jacket today. Usually I wear like the typical college professor little corduroy blaze thing, but I thought, yeah, I'm gonna wear the black leather and jacket. And but yeah, like, I mean, you in the South in particular, you know, conservative towns, you can be targeted. And some of y'all may know, you know, from you know, your style or the music you listen to, you have a target on your back. And I think that should scare us, and how law enforcement can do what they do with impunity so many times. I've seen it in my own life. I've seen it obviously in your case and other cases. And it should frighten us. But yeah, so, I mean, I think that's something that just us being here talking about this maybe lets people know that this is still happening. You're not the only person that this has happened to. You're lucky that you got out. So, and maybe y'all can both answer this too, because I know, Lorri, you were heavily invested in the case and helping get Damien out. But also we had big name people who were supportive. Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, Johnny Depp, Marilyn Manson, Henry Rollins, Peter Jackson. I mean, all these big people. I mean, do you think without them, you would still, well, I mean, not to sound morbid, but I mean, do you think you would even still be alive?
No, absolutely not. You know, that's one of the things that I kind of marvel at, or I used to think about it a lot, how, like, everything that led to me getting out of prison, everything, like, I looked back on it all and I saw it all as links in a chain, you know, like Lorri for the first time, seeing the Paradise Lost documentaries and reaching out to me, you know, whenever we first met, or even Joe Berlinger and Bruce Sinofsky, whenever they made these documentaries, every single thing was a link in a chain that led to me sitting here right now. And if you took one single link out of that chain, if you took one single person out of it, one single event out of it, I would be dead right now. You know, if you took the documentaries out, I would be dead. If you took Lorri out, I would be dead. If you took Peter Jackson out, I would be dead. Every single one of these people served like a very instrumental function in me getting out of there. But Lorri was the one who had to deal with most of these people. You know, I always tell people that, and this is 100% true, she did more work on this case than all of the attorneys and investigators put together. You know, we went through a dozen attorneys, because people think it's just the state that's corrupt. You know, they think that the state is the problem, that it's just like the prosecutor and the attorney general and the governor and things like that, but it is not. I mean, the defense in these cases is equally abhorrent most of the time. You know, we had to deal with absolutely horrendous things. You know, for example, if you get a public defender, you get what you pay for. You know, you're probably going to die on death row if you have a public defender. But a capital defense attorney will not touch your case without a retainer fee of at least $200,000 to take the case on. Most people in prison, not even most, I don't know anyone in prison that would be able to come up with $200,000. But even then, like Lorri at one point did everything she could to raise $200,000. She spent her whole life savings, you know, had to go around to all these people doing fundraisers and raising the money any way she could. She gets $200,000, gives it to this attorney, a defense attorney, and he just left. Just left me there to die. Just took the money. I had 6 months to live at that point. 6 months until they were going to execute me. He took every penny we had and just left me there to die. So it's not just the state. The defense is usually equally responsible for a lot of this stuff.
And I think going back to all of the support that we had, you know, Damien's talking about $200,000. I mean, I would think we've never really sat down and added it all up, but I think we ended up having to raise $4 million to get them out. And you don't come up with $4 million being work. You know, I'd taken a job with the city of Little Rock and was just, you know, whatever, I don't know, making $20,000 a year or something like that. And so the fact that these people who of means came onto the case enabled us to raise that kind of money, and they used their platform Johnny Depp did like a 48 hours show once, and this was at the peak of his career when he was doing, he's out doing Pirates of the Caribbean, and we asked him to do a 48 hours, and he did it. Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh, the filmmakers, they produced West of Memphis, and they started working on that before Damien, Jason, and Jesse got out of prison. So, these people were investing huge amounts of money into, Pearl Jam would do a concert and donate everything they made to DNA testing. And that's unheard of. I still to this day, I'm shocked at how much they invested in this, and how, and they all became friends of ours, not just throwing money at it. They were supportive. We're still friends with all of them to this day. And that's extraordinary, the care that was given. And when we did finally come upon the legal team that enabled us the right kind of work and the right kind of just instincts to get them out, it was in the 11th hour, but it took all, like Damien said, it took everything that everyone was doing in order to get to that place. And I'll forever be grateful for all the help that we got. I did a lot of work and devoted a lot of myself to it, but would never have been able to accomplish what I did without the help and even from people all over the world, people like y'all that stepped up and did fundraisers or, had concerts and just did anything that sent money into websites. It was a worldwide contribution of time and energy from people. It was extraordinary.
Yeah, and I think, just having that support, from outside people, especially people who have a big platform, is very important. But like you had said before, you feel really, really lucky because there's so many other people that you even saw on death row who nobody knew they were there. They didn't have the documentary made about their story, or they didn't have the coverage or the interest, the celebrity interest and that sort of thing. And I always appreciated that you talked about that too, like, hey, I'm not the only guy that this has happened to. This has happened to thousands of other people, and they are sitting on death row right now, and a lot of them are being wrongfully executed for something that they did not do. And so I guess that almost comes with a sense of, I don't know, maybe if it's, what's the word, like survivor's guilt almost, for you. It's like, you got out, right, and you were very lucky in having all this support, but I'm sure there's got to be a part of it that feels maybe kind of guilty for the people who didn't have those resources and who were executed. I don't know, maybe guilty isn't the right word, but do you ever think about, obviously you're very fortunate, but do you ever think about, is there anything that we can do for these other people who are sort of languishing away in a cell, and how we might be able to help them?
It's one of those things it's hard just because you can't make people care about something. It's like you were saying, like, the reason I think that people cared so much about this case was what you said earlier, that they watched this documentary and they saw something of themselves in me. Like they saw a situation where they thought, that could have been me. And that was what made them care about it. It sparked something in them. It forged some kind of personal connection. And you're not necessarily going to have that with every person, every case, every situation, and you can't force it. It was in our situation, it was a very organic thing. Like we had no idea that people were going to start caring about this case the way they did. When I went to prison, it wasn't always, like it is now, where people think, oh yeah, that's that innocent guy that was on death row. Like the first few years that I was in prison, there was almost no one that looked at me as an innocent person on death row. I had people like cheering the state on whenever they're talking about putting me to death. And I don't know how to go about doing it. But like, I think what it is, what happened in my case was not only did people identify with me, but when that happens, it makes people see you as a person, not a case, but a person. And that's what allows them to care about you, to feel like they know you in some way, to empathize with you. I think what is required is for that to happen. Like, that has to happen in other cases. And, you know, we were talking backstage before we came out about how a friend of ours who works on a lot of death penalty cases, they now estimate that 1 out of every 10 people who are executed are innocent. And if 1 out of every 10 planes crashed, people would stop flying until something was done to fix it. But most people don't realize, because you're not seeing it on TV, you're not seeing it in documentaries, that's the case, that it's that bad. So I think really what it comes down to, and it honestly, it's gotten a lot better, I think, in the past few years, in a really weird way, just because there's been this explosion of interest in crime documentaries. You know, there are tons of podcasts where people are talking about different cases now. It seems like every month you turn on Netflix and there's some new series about a case coming out. I think that is, you know, those are the things that save people's lives. Those are the things that are helpful. But at the same time, it's like, how do you force that? You know, you can't get people behind it unless they hear about it, and they can't hear about it unless there's something that's bringing it to their attention. So it's like this cyclical thing, and there is no easy answer to any of this stuff. You know, it's like we're talking about the difference, like people thinking the state is the only problem and how it's the entire system that's the problem. You know, there is no easy answer to any of this stuff. It's all like a dog chasing its own tail, or those images you see of the snake, you know, biting its own tail so that it forms this constant circle. I have no clue. I have people contacting me all the time. Like, at least once a week, I'll have somebody contact me and say, my brother, my husband, my cousin, my son, this guy I know, he's in prison for something he didn't do. He's on death row for something he didn't do. Will you help in some way? And I'm always like, you know, what do you think I can do? I can't even clear my own name. You know, I've been fighting this case for over 30 years now, and I'm still in it, and I can't even clear my own name. It's like there's nothing that I can do to help someone. If there were an easy answer, I would do it, but there's just not. Do you want to add something to that?
Yeah, and I mean, in cases like that, I mean, it almost could be a detriment to their case to have you supporting them, because there are a lot of people out there who still think, you know, because you haven't been exonerated, and that just blows my mind, because, you know, like any logical person would see that, you know, they're not going to let somebody off a death row who they believe, you know, did these horrible crimes just because, like, oh, we're going to give you time served. I mean, when has that ever happened? You know, and so it's like, to me, just that alone proves that they know they have no case against you. And to further that, if people need more convincing, it's like, if you were guilty, why would you still be fighting to get DNA testing? Right. Because you'd be afraid that they're going to find yours on there, and then you know. So it's like, I don't get it, you know. And I'm, you know, since I've been posting about this on social media, I've gotten a few of those, and I see them. I think you have thicker skin than I do after all these years of seeing those, and you say you just block them. But people love to get on there and talk about that, and it's not only mean, but it's like, I don't see how people can't just look at those basic two things. You know, like, no judge would let people out of prison, especially off a death row, just because they said, okay, I did it. And they're like, oh, okay, well, now you admit it, we'll let you go free. I mean, that would never, ever, ever happen, right? And so, you know, and then that you're following up to get exonerated, you know, because I can't imagine, like, the difficulties that are probably in both of y'all's lives, having this hanging over your head, right? Because I don't know, and if you don't feel comfortable answering this, you don't have to, but in the eyes of the state, you're still a felon, right? And so it makes it difficult for you to do things that, like, again, this is sort of my ignorance on this thing, but I mean, like, you're not allowed to vote as a felon. You're not, and it probably makes it difficult for you to travel.
Yes, I mean, when we were doing, like, promoting the documentary west of Memphis, trying to get it out there in film festivals and get people's, eyes on it, I was not allowed to go into Canada. Yeah. Like, Canada was like, no, you can't come in. We had to jump through tons of hoops, and eventually they came back and said, okay, you can come in for 48 hours, but if you're not out in 48 hours, we're going to come find you and throw you out. Or, my Zen teacher who used to come visit me from Japan, he would fly over from Japan to visit me on death row in Arkansas. I'm not allowed to go into Japan. I can't even go visit him because I still, whenever you look it up, like, legally, I still have a criminal record.
Yeah. And that's the thing, too. And so, I mean, like, and again, why I wanted to do this, to bring awareness, because people think, oh, well, Damien's out now. It's over. His life, he's free. He can do what he wants. He can go where he wants. But that's not the case. And so, I wanted, and I don't know if y'all have a petition set up or if there's some kind of thing where we can, and if you do, I would encourage everyone here and to tell your friends to sign it, put the pressure, because that's what it takes, is putting pressure on these people. And if they see thousands of signatures on this thing, they're more likely to speed up the process a little bit, move it from the bottom of the pile of their priorities, which to me, this should be their number one priority, but obviously they have reasons for it not being.
We do have a petition on the Innocence Project's website. So they have a whole update about the case, and so you can sign one there. Thank you.
So the Innocence Project website, and we can are there like a list of cases, or we could just search your name?
You can probably just search, but they put it up in the last 6 months or so, so it should be pretty easy.
And so we can sign that, and the more signatures, the better.
Yes.
Because that's one of the reasons why I wanted y'all to be here too, is because it's about helping. I want to see. I mean, I can't say just as much. I mean, because I know it has more of an impact on your lives. But I mean, I really want to see this close. Your name cleared, exonerated, and then there's no more of those trolls who come on YouTube and Instagram and say all these. I mean, that hurts my feelings when I read it. It's not even about me. And I guess you've learned how to sort of. One of your podcasts or your videos was about. It was called Dealing with Haters, and you said, there's a block button on there for a reason. I just look at those things and block them. I'm like, well, you're a bigger man than me, because those things hurt my feelings, and it's not even about me, but it's just like, why are people so mean?
When I was a kid, my dad used to say, like, if I would say something smart to him or something, he would say, yeah, if I had feelings, you would have just hurt them. And that's kind of what the attitude you have to develop with those kinds of things. The way I look at it now is I've been called every horrendous thing that a human being can be called. There are very few things that can be said about me that haven't already been said in one way or another. You have to, you can either spend the rest of your life worrying about that stuff, like trying to change, some individual person that's sitting in a basement somewhere typing comments on a YouTube video. You can, put in time and energy to try to change this person's opinion, which ultimately, if you did, what did it matter? It's not like it was going to change anything anyway. Or you learn to just focus on the things that actually do matter, the things that are important, the things that are going to be helpful to your life, your sanity, the case, whatever it is. And that was just kind of what I had to learn over time. One of the things you learn from almost 20 years in prison is there is a lot worse things in the world than someone calling you a bad name.
Yeah. And I've always appreciated that about your sort of outlook on that, because, some people in your situation could be very bitter, and really both of y'all, because, you spent, you got married, was it 1999? And that was the first time that you had been allowed to have physical contact where you could actually touch each other. And so your relationship was unique in that way, you know, and that required a lot of, I don't know what the word is I'm looking for, but just patience, maybe, for lack of a better word, but also it sort of suggests like the deep connection that you had, that it's not necessarily about just having physical contact. Yes, that's great to hug somebody and just hold their hand, or, you know, stroke their hair, or whatever, like those intimate gestures that we have. But y'all made it work without that, you know. And I remember seeing in your book that those crappy Polaroids that they would take in prison. I think they'd charge you like $10 for them, and the flash would be in the background so you could barely see your face. You know, and so it's, you know, you're dealing with all those things, and then, you know, the scrutiny of the guards, and I think that they were, it seemed like they were a little, maybe ticked off isn't the right word, but it's like, okay, a Buddhist wedding ceremony here in Arkansas, what's up with this? These weirdos want to come in here and do this thing, you know, but you did it, you know, and thankfully that there are rights, you know, where prisoners on death row can have a ceremony like that, and that was a beautiful ceremony, and I'm glad that y'all were able to do that. But I couldn't imagine having that sort of long distance relationship, and y'all collected those letters. I think there were a lot more that y'all had actually written back and forth that were actually in the book. But those were, one of my students in my class yesterday was showing me the letters that she was reading, and they're incredibly personal, but also very inspiring and moving, and it just shows, I think, it's a testament to, you know, without sounding cheesy, just like the power of just real love and connection, and what that can do, like, to save each other. You know, I think all good marriages are kind of based on that idea. It's like, I'm lifting you up, you're lifting me up, and it's a, you know, kind of like a team, sort of. We come together and we're gonna survive these things together. And that was really beautiful to read, and I admired that y'all shared that with the public. You know, to be able to read those letters is very touching.
It was not easy for me. Our editor was, she was just about ready. She was just done with me, because she had a lot more in there, believe me. And I would just come, no, I can't. My parents are going to read, you know, I can't. No, you can't say that. You can't cut this. And also, I didn't want to hurt anyone's feelings. When you're writing letters to someone about, you know, every part of your life, you know, sometimes you're going to complain about someone, or you're going to go off, and I wanted to be very careful about hurting someone's feelings. And so there were so many things about those letters. And David, you were talking about, you thought maybe there would be more. There were 5,000 letters that we had written to each other over the course of 16 years. And and I always say this to people, especially now. You know, our book may be one of the last book of letters that will be published, because people don't really, unless it's some archival, you know, thing from a long time ago, but people don't really write letters anymore. And I have to say, it is the most extraordinary way to get to know someone, because, especially if you're writing letters and sending them to someone, because it's just this whole thing about time and the way that you think when you write a letter, and how it can be a stream of consciousness and you're not getting interrupted. So it's just this whole thing. And then ideas start crossing and then especially we were writing letters, a letter every day, sometimes a couple a day. There were times when I would get 4 letters from Damien in a day. We were just crazy, like nutty, obsessed and silly, but it is a really wonderful way to get to know someone. And when you looked at our relationship, it all came down to connection. How many ways can we connect with one another? And that was the most important thing. So we had letter writing, and it eventually became possible for us to talk on the phone, very expensive, I might add, but we could talk on the phone. And then once I moved to Arkansas, I could go see him, and so I could see him for 3 hours a week. But then we started adding in other things like listening to the same radio program, on a Friday evening, or watching the same TV show at the same time, just to know that we were connected in any way that we could be. And I really do think what you're saying is true. It is all of the experiences of life that really do create a relationship with someone else. You have to, if you can go through them with them, and one is strong for the other, and sometimes you're both not strong, sometimes you both crash, and we both did. I mean, when Damien got out of prison, sure, we were happy, it was amazing, but the trauma that ensued was unspeakable. I can't even tell you what we went through in the years after he got out, and we both hit rock bottom. And to be able to sit here now and say that our lives are really good and we've come through it, and we're sitting here, and I'm so grateful that David brought us down to talk about it. We haven't talked to an audience in a while. It's been a few years. And so to be able to sit here now and know that we're healthy and we're happy and actually thriving is it's just amazing.
Now, I would also add what you were talking about how we didn't have these things that most people take for granted, like being able to hold hands or touch each other or things like that. It was miserable in some ways, but at the same time, it's pain that makes you stronger. You are never going to get any stronger. You are never going to get any better. You are never going to develop any more as long as you are comfortable. It's discomfort and it's pain that forces us to expand and grow and change. And that's exactly what the misery of that situation did to us. It forced us to discover how to form new connections in a way that we never would have done if we would have had access to the things that most people have and take for granted. If you've read the books, Life After Death or Our Letter, I can't remember exactly which one it was in, but we used to do things like we would make what we call moon water, where every month on the full moon, we would both fill a glass with water and try to catch the moon's reflection in the glass. And then for the rest of the month, every night at the same time, we would both take a drink from the glass that we had so that we knew in that moment we were both doing the exact same thing. No matter where we were in the world, what was going on, in that moment we were connected and doing the same thing. Most people out here it would never occur to them to do things like that. So yes, in some ways it was horrendously painful, but in other ways it forced us to become what we became, and that ultimately led to us surviving, things even out here that we would not have survived if we would not have formed those deep connections. Some people might call it codependency, but it worked for us and still does.
Yeah, and I wouldn't even say that was codependency. I mean, I feel like that's, you find creative ways to communicate, and I remember you said, and it's funny that you mentioned that because I was going to ask you all about that next. I thought that was beautiful, and it's the way you end the memoir. It's all in the moon water. It's all about the moon water. But you had talked about how some of the other inmates would say, man, you're out of your mind. What are you doing? What is this all about? But yeah, it's a way that you learn how to connect in a situation where you have very limited forms of communication. The letters, yes, the occasional phone calls, which one of my students is reading the Years for Eternity and says, I can't remember the quote that she gave me, but it was it something like $20,000 of phone charges over the years that you... 200,000. Yes, and so the prisons are a corporation, for lack of a better term, and they're there to make money. And I've read now, since email is a more common form of communication, I think, some prisons charge like $14 to send an email. you know? And so they're making profit. And so it's in their best interest to have as much prisoners as they can in there to make the most money possible. And like you had mentioned in your memoir, what they don't do is medical care, dental care, and they abused you physically, horrendously, and didn't do anything to treat you. And so you had to learn these practices to sort of forget the pain and sort of heal yourself, which is remarkable. Most people, I think it takes a rare person to be able to do that and not give up hope, which kind of leads me to the next topic I wanted to talk about. And I know these things go by always so much faster than I think they're gonna. But just the idea of writing, and we talked a little bit about the letter writing, but did you, and because to me this is what's amazing, is, you know, you said you had written 85% of your memoir while you were on death row. And I think about that, because I think, okay, here you are, you have an execution date set. We're going to murder you on May 5th, 1995, or whatever the first date was, and then they would change it. But you still had the gumption to get out of bed every morning, meditate, exercise, and write. Tell your story. And I, you know, as someone who teaches creative writing, and I always try to impart that on my students, is, you know, how powerful creative writing is, sharing your story, you know, because people can relate to it, but also because had they executed you, this document would still exist. And I know you had self-published it when you were in prison, and Margaret Cho, the comedian, had helped that. And then when you were released, it was published by Blue Rider Press. And yeah, I mean, I remember the first time I read that, I was just really moved, you know, by that perseverance, you know, because I mean, most people wouldn't do that.
I think, honestly, though, for me, I didn't really look at it as perseverance, you know, like something I had to do. I think that, like, if you're reading Life After Death, really at least 80% of that book started out as letters to Margaret Cho, the comedian. We used to write back and forth when I was in prison. And when I was writing these things, I wasn't writing them, you know, thinking that it's important to preserve, you know, whatever's happening now or any of that kind of stuff. I was writing because I loved the process of writing. Whether anybody was ever going to see it or not was almost secondary. You know, maybe they will, maybe they won't. You know, you look at how many people who write things that they die before anyone ever even has before they ever know that anyone's ever going to read their stuff. You know, look at like the guy from New Orleans that wrote Confederacy of Dunces. You know, when I first read that, I thought it was one of the most hilarious, amazing books I'd ever read. He couldn't get anybody to touch that book when he was alive. He killed himself, committed suicide, never saw the day when that book would go on to win all of these prizes and, you know, be read all over the world. I think that's kind of how you have to look at it. Don't be attached to the results. You know, don't be attached to, you know, being an author. Don't be attached to having a bestseller. Write because you love writing. And if you don't love doing it, then don't do it. Do whatever it is that you love. You know, life is very, very short. And that's kind of the way I always looked at it. The same way with all the other stuff you were just talking about, like whether it was, you know, working out, meditating, you know, there were times, as crazy as this sounds, that I didn't even think about the fact that I was in prison for days at a time. It wouldn't cross my mind because I became so immersed in the world that I had created in prison and in the world that Lorri and I had created together that, you know, I didn't even see those walls a lot of the times. I read a story one time about Timothy Leary. If y'all ever come across his work, he's the guy who, you know, did all the LSD experiments and stuff like that. But at one point, the federal government put him in prison for using LSD, doing all these experiments, and the guy that teaches like meditation. He died not too long ago. Ram Dass, he was a friend of his. He goes to see Timothy Leary in prison, and he tells him at one point, he says, look, we've come up with a plan. We're going to break you out of here. And Timothy Leary said, you can't do that. I've got too much work to do. That's how I felt like by the time I walked out of prison. Like I wasn't thinking about the case. I wasn't thinking about being abused by guards, any of that kind of stuff. For me, most people in the world don't even know what, ceremonial magic or Western esotericism is, like what the point of it is, what the practice is, or the concepts or philosophies or theories or anything else behind it is. But it was delving into that and starting to explore that world and do those practices and experiencing how it was changing me that made me so excited. Like when I would wake up in the morning, I slept on a concrete slab. That's your bed in there. It's a concrete slab with a little thin mat on it, almost like they give kindergartners to sleep on the floor, when you're a little kid. I used to go to sleep on that at night, and I would wake up in the morning excited because I got to start another day and do this stuff again. I wasn't thinking about being executed or anything else. I was thinking about what was happening to me because of these practices, the things that I was learning, and I was thinking about and being excited about the world that Lorri and I had forged together, the things we were talking about together, the things we were doing together. The practices, this will sound like a minor thing that doesn't seem miraculous to most people, but to me, it was a miracle. Like I said earlier, I had a Zen master that would fly back and forth from Japan to teach me when I was in prison, and I would sit Zen meditation for hours a day for years. But and I felt like I was never having these experiences that you read about whenever you hear about Zen. People talk about having these experiences of goes by all these different names, Satori or Kensho, or these little glimmers of enlightenment when you see or experience like the true nature of reality behind the illusion of the self and all this kind of stuff. I wasn't experiencing any of that. And I started to think, maybe this is all horseshit. Maybe all of spirituality is like the same thing as like the Protestant fundamentalist Christianity that I knew as a child was, which is all just about belief. And if that helps you in some way, fine. I'm not knocking that, whatever gets you through the day. But I didn't want to just believe in something. I didn't just want to hope for something or have faith that something was true. I wanted direct, firsthand experience of these things. And that was what ceremonial magic allowed me to have. The very first time I experienced anything, and this is what I mean, is it'll sound like a small thing to someone else, but to me it was a miracle. Like, Lorri said, we could see each other for 3 hours a week. That's pretty much the only time I ever saw anybody. Almost the last 10 years that I was in prison, I was in solitary confinement. Almost never put on clothes. What's the point of putting on clothes when you're never going to see anybody anyway? I wore, a pair of boxer shorts 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The only time I put on clothes is the 3 hours once a week when I would go down to the visitation room to see Lorri. I decided after I thought, this stuff must be horseshit. It's all just about what you believe and all this kind of stuff. So I'm going to give up on all of this and just focus on the real tangible world. But first, I'm going to go back to my childhood love of Western Hermeticism, ceremonial magic, and I'm going to give this one more shot. But I'm not going to approach it the way most people approach their religion, which is you get up on Sunday morning, you go to church, you go home that afternoon, and you don't think about it again for the rest of the week. You don't really think about prayer or anything else until you get in trouble or you need something in some way. And I think even in ceremonial magic, that's a lot of the way people approach like this form of spirituality. But I thought I'm going to give this one more shot, but this time I'm going to approach it with the same level of dedication and commitment that I have applied to Zen, which was sitting hours a day for years at a time. I said, I'm going to give it a couple of months, see what comes of it. I'm doing these rituals every day, and I was thinking of this because you said, people in prison were saying, like, what are you doing when you're making moon water? I had people in prison ask me that a lot. Like, even in there was a guy one time, This was a man who had beaten another man to death with a can of hominy. He had killed a man with canned goods. And this was a guy that looked at me one day and said, "What is wrong with you?" You know, because of the things I was doing. Even these practices, you know, you're doing all these things like drawing these geometric shapes in the air while you're practicing breathing exercises and visualization and stuff like that. And I had a guy one day ask me, he said, "Why are you always standing there pointing at the wall?" You know, so people in there thought something was wrong with me a lot of times, I think. But what happened one day, I'm getting dressed, I'm going down to see Lorri, and I reached down to put my shoes on, and it was like a bomb went off in my head because I realized for the very first time in my entire existence, I am fully and completely in the present moment. The second you realize that, it's shattered and you're back to conceptual thinking. You're not just in the experience anymore. You're thinking about the experience. You're thinking about life. But for a split second, I had experienced with ceremonial magic what several years of Zen had not let me experience. And whenever I went through that, whenever I felt that, whenever I realized what was happening, it was this feeling of, oh my God, this stuff is not all horseshit. Like, it actually works. If you do this stuff the way like these old school teachers who dedicated their lives to these practices have, it actually does something to you. It changes you. Whenever I realized that that was a thing, it lit me on fire. I wanted to know what else is possible. Like, what other experiences can you have through this stuff that the rest of the world probably thinks is just horseshit? So from that point on, I almost kind of wasn't even thinking about prison anymore. And I realized I've been going on for a long time, so I'm going to shut up.
Well, no, and I'm glad that you talked about that because, I mean, I think, you find, and I know you're a Stephen King fan or were a Stephen King fan, and unfortunately, not surprisingly, that was actually one of the pieces of so-called evidence that they used against you. It's like, well, this guy reads these weird books, so he must have done this crime, which is just wild. And I listened to a podcast with you some time ago where they had you on to talk about the Dark Tower series, and I remember thinking, wow, this is the most excited Damien has sounded, because you've done all these other interviews where you kind of rehash the same thing, and you just sounded like with this childlike excitement talking about the Dark Tower, and I thought, yeah, it'd be cool to talk about like some literature and stuff. I know we're running out of time, but this relates to writing, I think, in a way too. Is some people might be surprised if you haven't read the memoir, the collection of letters, or the other books. You have an interesting sense of humor. I mean, there were times when I was reading your book where I would just laugh, which sounds weird, right? It's about a book, someone who's on death row facing being murdered by the state. But there were parts in there where this, and you can't fake humor. I think it's part of your personality. And when I first met you this morning, we were already just kind of like laughing about just little absurd things that we notice or whatever. But two things in your memoir that I really thought were funny. And take this how I mean it, because I mean it's not to diminish like the horrific experience. But at one point, so this guy Jerry Driver, who was sort of instrumental in the harassment, and of course that ties into the poverty and the lack of education that your parents had. They didn't know. We have rights here. We don't have to let this guy take our son and commit him to a psychiatric hospital and all this stuff. So here he comes, picks you up, takes you there, leaves you in there. And at one point you write about they give you like a little day pass, 24-hour day pass. And this is one of those other, we were talking about coincidences and things like that. And so you're in like Little Rock or something, which is far away from West, I think that's where you were in the psychiatric unit. And so on the day pass, you go with your family, they don't have a lot of money, so you go to McDonald's, right? And you walk in, and of all people to be in that McDonald's was your high school marching band. and so it's like miles and miles away, and they're like, Damien, what the hell are you doing here? And then you said, like, most people would probably be like, oh, nothing, we're just driving through town. And you're like, no, I'm just on a 24-hour leave from a mental institution. And they just got a big kick out of that, Maybe that ended up hurting you in the long run, and so it's like, man, this guy's really crazy, we should definitely use this as evidence against him. But I appreciated that humor, and also you, Lorri, I think you have an appreciation for the absurd in life, which, to use a cliche, humor is the spice of life. And I remember in the West of Memphis documentary, Damien, you were talking about how, and hopefully I don't embarrass you, Lorri, but it was in the documentary, so most people have seen it know. But when you were a kid, you actually made up this contest and awarded yourself first prize in the contest, and then had a parade for the contest with the little banner on the side of the car and paraded you. And I hope I'm not embarrassing you with this, but the point of it is, both of you seem to have a sense of humor about this horrible, horrible thing. Not to diminish the significance of it or take away from the horrendousness of it, but as a way to sort of cope with it, or maybe it's just part of your personalities. And then even in the exchanges that you've had with each other in your letters and stuff, there's humor there, and I appreciated that. And I don't know if one of y'all wanted to talk about that, if that's just something innate in your personalities, or something you felt like it was a way to help you cope.
No, I think it's definitely part of our, first of all, I have to say the parade, it wasn't trying to glorify myself. I was really mad because my elementary school, they gave all their money to the sports program, and so they wouldn't buy the Nancy Drew series or the Hardy Boys for the library.
I used to love that.
So I wrote this, I did make it up, and I wrote a letter to the Board of Education or something, and said that my letter won the contest. There was no contest. I just wanted people to become aware of our problem at the school. Anyway, so that in itself should tell you that there's a little bit of nuttiness going on here. But yeah, no, Damien and I, he makes me laugh all the time, all the time. And any of you all who are in a relationship and you get in a fight and you know that, that's just horrible. You're in a fight, and especially when you're getting to know one another, it seems like that's when more fights happen. You're trying to establish who you are and what it is you're doing. And I would tend to just go full into those. And Damien, every single time, would just try to make me laugh, because that breaks the tension. You can come back to who you are. And it took me forever to realize that that's the smartest thing you can do, is just to laugh about something. Nothing is that dire when you've got someone on death row. And for that matter, here's the thing, I can never say no to him. He gets everything in our relationship, because what are you going to do, deny him anything? It's so funny. It's like, we were talking about movies, and we always see his movies, because it's like, oh, he's on death row for a long time. So, yeah, but no, we're not codependent at all. Sorry. No, but the sense of humor thing, I think, is the only thing that got us through. I really do believe that, and and I'm so blessed to have someone that can make me laugh night and day.
Oh yeah, I think it's very therapeutic, very important getting through things. Another thing I thought was funny and and again, we were talking when we were walking over here about just things that most people just write off as like a weird little coincidence or something, and I tend to see more meaning in those things. And other people always look at me like I'm a weirdo, because of that. But and I'm forgetting what the example I was going to use. Maybe it'll come back to me. But just, appreciating those little signs that we get sometimes in life, and noticing them and then acknowledging them is also important in relationships too. And just the way that this all happened. I reached out, and I had mentioned earlier, like the day after that Damien had posted on Instagram, like, I'll never do another interview again, and I thought, oh crap, like, I made him mad, and then Lorri reached out and said, no, we'd love to do it. So I was like, okay, yeah, that's great. And so I always like kind of look into things a little bit, maybe too much. And I forget where the other, it had to do with humor, and I'm not going to try to like shuffle through all my giant index cards here to find it. But I just agree. I think that humor is a great way to sort of keep a relationship alive, healthy, laugh together. And it seems like you guys, and we've laughed just since I met y'all at your car. We walked over here, we've just been laughing and talking. You mentioned movies. We were talking about movies backstage. I know movies are very, very important to you, Lorri and Damien also. But you seem to have very different tastes in movies. And the same thing I was mentioning, my wife didn't have a sort of pop culture background in movies, so she hadn't seen like Ferris Bueller's Day Off and things that I'd grown up watching. I think just like with books and art, movies are sort of like a form of communication and a way of connecting with other people. And not to sound melodramatic, but if it hadn't been for the movie made about your case, and I may have already said this already, like you would literally not be sitting. And so that again is a testament. And I was telling y'all, and just to share with y'all that hopefully we pick this back up again. But my wife and I, one of our first dates was to see Vertigo by Alfred Hitchcock at the Columbia Theater, which is the coolest thing to say is like your first date. I think that would be cool to bring back. Showing. And you did the thing at the Broad Theater y'all were talking about where you showed some movies. And oddly enough, I was at the Broad Theater about 2 weeks ago. My brother-in-law, his wife was on Family Feud, and they did like a screening of it, like the episode that they were on. They didn't win, by the way. But it was still cool. We went there, and I had been researching you beforehand, so I'd seen that you had done that. You hosted that event, did the movie event. And this is going to sound weird, maybe to most people, but I don't think it'll sound weird to y'all. But the whole time I was there, I kept thinking, like, it felt like your energy was still in that building. And maybe that sounds weird, but I don't care. And you've talked about like morphic energy, and I don't know if you believe that sort of energy kind of expands out. Like, so when you're in a place, like you're here now, and maybe this is just me, but like any other time from now on when I walk back in this building, like I'll still be able to like feel a piece of you here. And I was thinking of, again, speaking of movies, Johnny Depp, again, a big supporter of yours. Have y'all seen the movie Blow? Great movie. And my son, who's only 15, he says that's his favorite movie. So I hope that's not a bad thing. It's a great movie, but it's like, do you have aspirations to travel around and be a big cocaine dealer? I hope not. But at the end of the movie, sort of after his downfall, he's, saying, I felt like in my life I've left pieces of my heart throughout the world. And it kind of reminded me of that, like when you go places, you do leave bits of yourself here and there. So I guess the question is, do you believe that? Do y'all believe that? I know it sounds strange, but do y'all believe that?
I don't think it sounds strange at all. It's the entire reason that we ended up in New Orleans. Like in magic, there's a word they call it, it's called an egregore. And what an egregore is like the soul of a place or a concept, or it can be, it can range from like a solid concrete location to something much more abstract. But for me, I have always had very intense relationships with places. Like New York was the first place that I ever in my entire life felt like I was home. I never wanted to leave that place for any reason. I did not want to travel. That place to me was a friend. It was a teacher. It was, closer to me than a family member had ever been. Well, what an egregore is, it's like a combination of the history of a place, like everything that's ever happened there while that location has existed, as well as a combination of all the combined energies and beliefs and attitudes and everything else of the people that currently inhabit it versus, used to inhabit it. It's why you see places change, just like people change. Sometimes they grow, they, become more vibrant. Other times they become stagnant and eventually die off. But for me, place has always been very, very important. And when you're looking at places in the U.S., there came a time, like after COVID, New York was a completely different place. To me, the only way I can describe it, the only way I can come close to articulating it is if you were walking down the street one day and you saw somebody and you ran up to them and you're like, hey man, how's it going? And they turn around and they look at you and this is their body. This is not someone who looks like them. This is their body. But whoever that is looking at me out of their eyes is not the same person that it was the last time I ran into them. That's how New York felt to me. The soul of the city had been changed. And I did not feel that connection that I had anymore. And I knew I've got to leave because I was kind of in a really deep state of mourning because of that. The only place in the U.S. that we looked at that we even considered moving to after New York was New Orleans, because this is another one of those places that has one of those incredibly powerful egregores. I think who was it? Was it Bob Dylan that said there's only 3 cities in the world, 3 cities in the U.S., New York, New Orleans, and San Francisco. Everywhere else is Cleveland.
I think that's Tennessee Williams.
Tennessee Williams. That's it. Yeah, I would even scratch San Francisco off of there. There were only 2 cities in the U.S. And, one of the ways that you can tell, like, a place has, like, a powerful egregore or a powerful soul attached to it is when someone says that name to you, you automatically have images coming into your mind. Like when someone says New York City to you, you see the Statue of Liberty, you see taxi cabs, maybe you see bagels and pizza slices. There's all of these connotations that just automatically come into your mind when you think of New York. Same way, when somebody says New Orleans, you have all of these images come into your mind. Mardi Gras, voodoo, the swamps, the French Quarter. Like, there is a very powerful, rich soul connected to this place. And that was why we wanted to move there. So I don't think what you're saying is crazy at all. As a matter of fact, it's been like one of the guiding things of my life, is the relationships of places and the energy of those places. Even like you brought up the Duncan Trussell show, the Midnight Gospel cartoon earlier, when we did that, it was a weird situation first because I did this interview with him on a book promotion tour, and they give me the address to go to. We show up at the address, and it's his house. It's just his house in the middle of a neighborhood. And he opens, we're like, are we in the right place? This doesn't seem right. But we go up and knock on the door, and this guy answers the door, and he's wearing a fireman's hat that says, "On fire for Jesus." And the first thing I thought was, we're not in the right place. But it turned out we were. But we go in, we start talking about all these things, and we had like a really great conversation that just kind of flowed, and we were talking about all these different concepts. Like, it felt like the energy in that room was really dense, like fog, whenever I left. And he told me later, he said, yeah, after you left, he said, I felt that linger in that room. Like, I would walk in there and I would feel it for like a week afterwards, until one day, like, a bunch of my friends came over and they were all drinking and getting high, and it kind of destroyed it. But yeah, I believe that's absolutely a thing.
Well, that's good. So that makes me feel less like a weirdo. Because the whole time I was walking around the Broad Theater, I had known that you had done that thing there. It just felt like y'all's presence was there. And that's cool. And so now your presence is here, and will hopefully stay after y'all are gone. I don't know what we're doing on time. I know there's another event that's supposed to come in after, and it seemed like there was one other thing I wanted to ask y'all really quickly. We didn't decide to open it up to audience Q&A, unfortunately, but I did I sent out a lot of emails and notices on social media for audience to submit questions, and I had a couple. I think I have time to read one, if I can find it now in all my... I was kind of doing like the David Letterman thing with my big old note cards here. So one of the audience questions that I'm going to ask is from Ken Bolton. I'm not sure if you met him. He's the department head of sociology and criminal justice, who was a lifesaver in helping me to get this organized and support and all the logistics of it and everything. But he was curious about, and so we talked about this earlier, and you weren't even really sure of the new governor and his policies and all this sort of thing. So we won't really get into the politics of that. But what I thought I would turn the question into is, in the interview that you did with Henry Rollins, you were talking about, the death row inmates who were on death row with you. And, that like the average IQ of those inmates was like 85, some of them 65. And they were killing these men. And one of the things that just, every time I even read it, it just kind of makes me cry to imagine this. But there was one guy who was being executed. They asked him what his last meal would be. And he said, I would like pecan pie. And so they give him the pecan pie. He eats half of it, and then he says, I want to save the other half for after. Because he couldn't even comprehend what they were about to do to him. And so, if for no other reason, what your thoughts are on the death penalty or anything, is like, we're executing people like that who have no idea what's happening to them. So I don't know if you wanted to elaborate on that at all, or just kind of just address that, like how, and like how you were saying when we were talking back there, like 1 in 10 people who are executed are innocent, and if there were any other circumstance, like you had mentioned the plane, so if 1 in every 10 planes crashed, and we knew that, people wouldn't fly planes anymore, right? They wouldn't want to get on an airplane. And I'm sure you saw a lot of things that were even worse than that. So, I mean, how do you reconcile that, or how do you sort of...
I really don't get into politics at all. Like, to the point whenever we were talking earlier and he brought up the governor's name, I was like, I didn't know who that was. I did not know who the governor of Louisiana was, because honestly, I don't give a shit. It's like when I was a kid growing up, I used, like, the only thing I knew of politics whatsoever was I met Bill Clinton one time when I was in like 5th grade, and they took us on a field trip to the Capitol when he was still governor, and he came in and shook everybody in the house in the class's hand, and we were like, who is this guy, And I used to think, when you're in prison, you have to pay attention to that stuff, because your life depends on who does or doesn't get elected, what their policies are, all that kind of stuff. But I used to think, one day I want to live a life where I don't have to be aware of that stuff again, where I don't have to think of it again. And without even realizing it, that happened. I didn't realize it until we were talking about the governor earlier. But, long story short, when it comes to things like the death penalty and the criminal justice system, there is no easy answer. There's not like blanket statements. It's not like black and white scenarios. There are vast shades of gray that, I'm not one of the greatest thinkers in the world. I've never claimed to be. I don't want to be. I think the more you think about things, honestly, the more miserable life gets. I don't know. So I can't give you answers to what to do, what not to do, as far as like fixing the system, any of that kind of stuff, because I've been in it deeply enough to know that there is no one fix-all situation or scenario. Just for example, we're talking about 1 out of every 10 people that they execute is innocent. Well, that means 9 out of 10 are guilty. Does that mean that they should automatically be executed? Not necessarily, no. I'm not in favor of that, of just executing innocent people. Of executing people that may not be innocent. But at the same time, I was in there long enough to also see that there are people in there that if they get the chance again, they are going to murder again. For no reason sometimes. Just they wake up and have a bad day and decide, I'm going to kill somebody, and that's it. They kill somebody even in prison. So it's not like you can just, open the gates and say, okay, let everybody go home. There is no easy fix. It's going to take somebody a hell of a lot smarter than me to come up with some sort of solution to these kind of problems.
Well, so they were signaling me back there. I think they have another event coming in soon. So, Lorri, did you have any comments or final thoughts first? Like, the Jerry Springer thing, the final thought that you wanted to share with us about, because my last question was going to be like, so what's next for you guys? So, if you want to answer that, or just anything you wanted to talk about.
I'd like to actually turn it more to everyone here and to you, and to anyone who is interested in hearing what we have to say, that we're just really grateful to you. And,
thank you.
Yeah, and all of the people back in whenever it was, 1996, whenever it was that you saw the film, and to this day, it's still important enough to you to put this together. I'm so grateful to everyone here, you and everyone who made it possible, Joshua, and just our reception here. Thank you all.
We realize. I just wanted to add that we know there's a lot of stuff you could be doing with your time and energy right now, so the fact that you wanted to be here to spend this morning with us, we are very, very appreciative of that. We are extremely grateful for your attention, because like we've always said, that's what kept me from being murdered, the fact that people cared about us and cared about this case, so we appreciate it very, very much.
Yeah.
And I'll just say, I know we have to get off the stage, but Lorri and Damien both have Patreon accounts. Are they called accounts? I'm not sure what they're Patreon. And so feel free to look them up and subscribe. There are different levels of subscriptions where you can hear they teach. You can get handmade artwork that y'all have done, I think, and some writings, Lorri, that you have done. And every little bit helps, right? With this case. And so look that up. Look up the petition. We can look that up, and I can share it out with students. And the more signatures, the better. The harder we can push against the people. Maybe we can get something to happen. But thank y'all so much for being here. It was great to meet y'all. And thank y'all for coming here. This was really nice to see such a large turnout.